The silence of space was shattered by a flash of light, an explosion of energy so intense that it could be seen even from Earth's orbit. Across the planet, the skies flickered with electromagnetic interference, signaling the arrival of a threat like no other. It wasn't a meteor shower, nor a comet's passing. No, this was something much worse. Captain Elias Vorm stood on the command deck of the Vanguard, the ship he had commanded in his previous life as Earth's top military tactician. The once pristine vessel now felt like a relic, dusty, barely functional, and nearly forgotten. But now it hummed with the energy of a mission that could either save or doom humanity. "Captain," a voice broke through the tension. Lyra Vavin, a physicist-turned-weapons expert, stepped forward, her face illuminated by the flickering lights of the command console. "The readings, this is impossible. The Nihil shouldn't be here. They were destroyed, wiped out in the last Galactic War." "Seems they weren't," Elias muttered under his breath. The images on the holoscreen confirmed her fears. An armada of dark ships, each one massive, their hulls glistening with alien technology, all converging on Earth. The Nihil, the race of conquerors that had terrorized the galaxy centuries ago, were not extinct. They had merely been biding their time, waiting for the galaxy to forget their brutality. The first wave of ships decimated Earth's outer defense satellites in seconds. Earth's military scrambled, but it was clear that nothing humanity had could touch these invaders. The sheer force of the Nihil's weapons tore apart Earth's satellites with a speed that made the defenses seem laughable. The aliens had come prepared, with weaponry and tactics far beyond Earth's capabilities. A sense of doom settled over the team. The terror wasn't just in their numbers. It was in the sheer elegance of their destruction. "They're preparing to strike Earth." Xander Kane's voice cut through the tension, his rough tone laced with urgency. "The Nihil don't waste time. They're not here for peace talks. They're here for total annihilation. We can't fight them conventionally," Lyra stated grimly, tapping rapidly on the control panel. "Their tech is too advanced. Our ships would be obliterated before we even made a dent." "So, what's the plan?" Elias' voice was steady, betraying no sign of fear, though his mind was racing. He had led Earth through countless conflicts, but this was something else. The Nihil didn't just want to conquer. They wanted to break humanity, to erase the idea that Earth could resist. "There's only one way we have a chance," Lyra said, her voice a mix of determination and dread. "We need the Vanguard. We need you, Captain." The room fell silent. Elias looked around at the faces of the men and women who had been pulled from the brink of obscurity, individuals from every corner of the Earth. They had been chosen for their abilities, their resilience, and their potential to face the impossible. This wasn't just about military tactics. This was about humanity's survival. Elias looked at each of them, his voice resolute. "We're going to stop them. Not because we're stronger, but because they've underestimated us. This is what we're trained for. This is why we exist." He turned to the rest of the team, his eyes meeting theirs. It's time for the last stand. As the Vanguard powered up for its first mission, the crew knew that what they were about to face was beyond any battle they had fought before. The Nihil weren't just another enemy. They were a force of nature, an extinction-level threat. But the Vanguard was humanity's last hope, and Earth's greatest heroes were about to take the fight to an enemy who believed victory was already theirs. As the Vanguard broke orbit, leaving Earth behind, the weight of the task ahead hung over them. Yet, for the first time in a long time, there was a spark of something else: hope. They would fight, not for Earth's survival alone, but for the legacy of humanity. The Vanguard shot through space, its sleek frame cutting through the void toward the Rendevis point, where the Nidal scout ship was expected to arrive. The hum of the engines was steady, but the tension on board was palpable. The crew, still getting to know each other, moved through the halls with the unspoken understanding that they were all that stood between Earth and annihilation. Lyra Valen sat at the ship's main console, her fingers dancing across the controls with practiced ease. She had a mind for patterns, something that had earned her a reputation as one of Earth's foremost scientists. But the technology she was now interfacing with was far beyond anything humanity had ever encountered. The Nidal's ships were unlike anything she had studied, their systems an intricate web of complexity. And yet, she was determined to understand it. If she could hack into even a fraction of their systems, it could give them a fighting chance. "How much longer until we reach the scout ship?" Elias asked, standing beside her, his gaze scanning the displays. 15 minutes, she replied without looking up, her focus unwavering. "We'll need to get close enough to board, but not too close. If we're detected before we can disable their systems, this will be over before it starts." Elias nodded. He could feel the weight of every second ticking away, knowing that the fate of Earth rested on their ability to outwit an enemy far stronger than themselves. In the crew quarters, Xander Kane was preparing for the mission ahead. His mind raced as he checked his weapons, his signature combat knife strapped to his thigh, his plasma pistol holstered at his side, and his standard-issue assault rifle slung over his shoulder. He wasn't nervous. He had faced impossible odds before. But there was something about the Nile that unsettled him. Their efficiency, their ruthlessness, it was like fighting an unstoppable force of nature. They didn't just kill, they erased. Serkor, standing across the room, noticed his restlessness. Her presence was quiet, almost ethereal, as she adjusted the settings on her own gear. Despite her alien heritage, she had quickly become a valued member of the team. Her ability to manipulate gravity made her a formidable asset. Sia's sharp eyes met Xander's for a moment, reading the unease on his face. "You're thinking too much," she said in her soft voice. "That's how people get killed." Xander glanced up, managing a smirk. "I think too much? You've got to be kidding." She raised an eyebrow, unperturbed by his sarcasm. "You'll be fine, but don't forget, we're all in this together. There's no room for second-guessing now." Xander nodded, though her words didn't ease the nagging feeling at the back of his mind. Still, he knew she was right. This was the mission that would define them all. As the Vanguard approached the scout ship, the crew gathered in the ship's war room. The holoprojector flickered to life, displaying a three-dimensional map of the enemy vessel's projected path. Lyra's voice broke the silence. "The Nile ship is large, far bigger than anything we've seen before. It's equipped with a cloaking system, so we won't be able to detect them until they're practically on top of us." Elias folded his arms, studying the map. "We'll need to get on board before they realize we're here. We'll approach from their blind spot and board using the airlocks. Once inside, we disable their main systems. Lyra, you're with me. Xander, Shia. You'll provide support and cover us as we move in. If things go south, we extract immediately." The team nodded in agreement. No one spoke about the potential risks, though each of them was keenly aware of the danger. The Nihil weren't known for their mercy. This mission could very well be a one-way ticket for some of them. The Vanguard slowed as it neared the Nihil ship's cloaked position. The crew stood in silence, waiting for the call. Their hearts beat in unison, each person mentally preparing for the worst. As they dropped into position, the tension thickened. Every sound aboard the ship seemed amplified. Every movement felt like a countdown. Now, Elias muttered under his breath. With a sudden burst of speed, the Vanguard closed the distance, its sleek form emerging from the shadows. In a flash, the airlocks of the enemy vessel opened, and the team was inside. What they found was not what they expected. The ship's corridors were eerily quiet, darkened, and unsettlingly sterile. It was a place designed to intimidate, with walls that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The team moved in, their footsteps muted on the metal floor as they advanced cautiously. "This doesn't feel right," Xander whispered, his hand resting on the grip of his rifle. "It's too quiet." Lyra, scanning her surroundings, nodded. "I've got a bad feeling about this. They're letting us in. On purpose." Just then, a blinding light flooded the hull, and the ship's defense systems activated. Energy barriers shot up, trapping the team in place. The Nihil had known they were coming all along. "We've been set up," Elias growled. The mission was no longer about stealth. It was a fight for survival. The sound of the Nihil forces approaching echoed through the corridors. The Vanguard had just stepped into the fire, and the inferno was only beginning. The hum of the energy barriers grew louder as the corridors were bathed in an eerie red light. Elias felt his heart race as he surveyed the situation, trapped, with no way out. The Nihil forces were closing in, their steps heavy and methodical. But it was the silence that unnerved him most. The enemy wasn't rushing to engage. They were savoring the moment, letting the fear fester in the air. "Lyra, any chance you can disable these barriers?" Elias asked, his voice low and urgent. Lyra was already at work, her fingers moving rapidly across the holographic interface projected from her wrist device. "I'm trying," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "Their system is unlike anything I've ever seen. It's got some sort of adaptive defense. I need more time." Xander gripped his rifle tightly, his eyes scanning the shadows for any movement. "Time is one thing we don't have," he muttered, glancing at the walls, which seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. He could hear the Nihil approaching, faint, deliberate steps that sent a shiver down his spine. "We're running out of options here." Sia's eyes flickered with an unusual intensity. "We need to create an opening," she said. "I can manipulate gravity. I can make a path through these walls if I concentrate hard enough. But I need a distraction." Elias didn't hesitate. He looked at Xander and Lyra. "We're going to have to buy her that time. We move fast, hit hard, and get her the opening she needs." Xander nodded, adjusting his stance, his eyes now steely with focus. "On your mark." Elias raised his hand, signaling to Sia to get ready. He turned back to Lyra, his voice cold. "Keep working. We don't stop until those barriers go down." The sound of boots grew louder, and in the next instant, the first wave of Nihil soldiers rounded the corner. They were tall, imposing figures, their dark armor reflecting the red glow of the ship. Their eyes glowed faintly, a cold and hollow light that spoke of a race devoid of mercy. At their leader's side was a creature far more terrifying, a towering armored brute, its face a mask of hatred and savagery. "Now," Elias shouted. Xander and Sia acted simultaneously. Xander opened fire, the sound of his plasma rifle ringing out as energy bolts seared through the air. The Nihil soldiers stumbled back, their armor absorbing most of the shots, but the impact was enough to send them scattering. Sia, her eyes glowing with an inner power, concentrated, and with a sudden burst of force, the gravity in the corridor warped, pushing one of the Nihil soldiers into the ceiling with bone-crushing force. Lyra, her fingers moving with desperation, muttered under her breath. "Almost." There's a pattern to their energy field. If I just... Yes. The energy barriers flickered, and for a split second, a gap opened. Get through? Elias barked, drawing his weapon and charging toward the breach. Sia, on me. The team sprinted toward the opening, the Nidal forces regrouping behind them. But they couldn't stop now. They had to reach the heart of the ship, the central core where the Nagil's command systems were housed. If they could neutralize it, they might be able to turn the tide. They rounded a corner and found themselves in a massive chamber, an altar of sorts, with glowing runes etched into the walls. It was the heart of the Nigel ship, an energy nexus pulsing with an unnatural, malevolent power. The walls themselves seemed alive, thrumming with energy as though the ship itself was sentient. "This is it," Lyra said, her voice filled with awe and dread. "The central core. If we can disable this, we'll cripple the ship." Elias glanced at her, his expression set. "Then let's get to work." But before they could move, a low growl echoed from the shadows. The ground beneath their feet trembled as a massive, armored Nigel warrior emerged from the darkness, a towering behemoth, its glowing eyes fixed on them with deadly intent. It was the Nihil commander. With a roar, the creature lunged, its massive sword raised high. The team barely had time to react as it swung the weapon down with the force of a crashing meteor. Elias dove out of the way, but Sander was not so lucky. The blade struck his rifle, sending sparks flying as the weapon was torn from his hands. "Stay down," Elias shouted, his mind racing. "We're not done yet." The commander's eyes narrowed, locking onto Elias as if sensing him as the greatest threat. The creature snarled, stepping forward with relentless purpose. It was clear that the Nihil didn't care about the rest of the crew. They wanted Elias dead. The battle was about to become far more personal. The Nihil commander's glowing eyes locked onto Elias with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Its massive frame towered over the team, its dark armor gleaming like a monstrous shadow in the pulsating light of the central core. The ground trembled as it raised its enormous weapon, a jagged black sword that seemed to hum with an unnatural power. Elias's instincts kicked in. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the commander's devastating swing. The air crackled as the sword tore through the space where he had just been, its energy leaving a trail of sparks and heat in its wake. "Thunder," Elias shouted, rolling back onto his feet. "Get up. We need to move." Xander, still recovering from the initial strike, pushed himself to his knees, his face contorted in pain, but with fire in his eyes. "I'm not done yet," he growled. He reached for his plasma pistol and fired a quick burst at the commander, but the shots merely bounced off the armor, leaving the creature unfazed. Cher was already on the move, her body blurring as she manipulated gravity to create a barrier of force between them and the commander. The impact of the Nihil's weapon hitting the invisible shield sent a shockwave through the room, but Saya stood firm, her eyes glowing with determination. "Keep him distracted." Sia called, her voice steady despite the strain. "Lyra, do what you need to do." Lyra, her face tight with concentration, quickly scanned the central core systems, her fingers dancing across her device. "I'm working on it. I need a few more seconds." The Nihil commander, enraged by the shield, snarled and slammed its fist into the gravity barrier, sending ripples of force through the room. The shockwaves rattled the walls, and the ground beneath them shook. The commander stepped forward, its eyes glowing brighter, a deadly growl rumbling from deep within its chest. "We're not going to last much longer," Xander said, his voice laced with urgency. He raised his pistol again and fired, the plasma rounds sizzling as they ricocheted off the commander's armor. This thing is a tank. Elias took a deep breath, his mind racing. They needed to buy time. Time for Lyra to disable the core. Time for them to find a way through the wall of destruction that was the commander. "Sia!" Elias shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We need to get this thing off balance." Sia's eyes flickered, and with a swift gesture, she changed the gravity in the room again. The floor beneath the commander's feet buckled as it was suddenly pulled downward, throwing it off balance. The creature staggered, its massive frame swaying as the gravity shift sent it crashing to one knee. "Now," Elias shouted. With lightning speed, Elias dashed forward, drawing his combat knife from its sheath. He closed the distance between himself and the commander, his mind focused on the weak spots in the creature's armor, every inch of it now exposed with the creature on its knee. Xander moved to provide cover fire, his plasma pistol crackling as he sent shot after shot at the commander. Each hit seemed to do little more than scratch the surface, but it bought Elias enough time to get close. With a roar, Elias leaped into the air, twisting his body to land a blow with his knife into a gap in the commander's armored shoulder. The knife scraped off the thick metal, but Elias didn't relent. He shifted his weight and brought the blade down with all his strength into the vulnerable joint. The commander let out an unearthly roar, its glowing eyes flashing with pure hatred. It swung its massive sword in a wild arc, narrowly missing Elias as he ducked beneath the strike. "Lyra!" Elias shouted, dodging another blow. "We need that core offline now." Lyra's fingers flew across her console as she bypassed the Nigel security systems, hacking into their command structure. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. If she failed, everything would be lost. Almost there, she muttered, beads of sweat forming on her brow. With a surge of power, Sia manipulated the gravity again, sending the commander crashing to the ground with a bone-shattering thud. The creature struggled beneath the force, its sword clattering to the floor. It wasn't finished, but it was temporarily incapacitated. "That should hold it," Sia said, her voice tight with strain. "Keep it down," Xander warned, reloading his pistol. "We can't afford another swing from that thing." Elias nodded, his pulse racing. He took a step back, watching the commander struggle to rise, but it was clear now. Their window of opportunity was closing fast. They had mere seconds before the creature regained its footing and turned this fight back in its favor. "Lyra!" Elias barked, his patience thinning. "This is it. Disable the core now, or we're all dead." Lyra's eyes locked on the central control panel as the ship's systems flickered and groaned under her assault. The countdown clock on her device flashed red. She punched in the final code. And then, with a deep, echoing rumble that shook the very foundations of the ship, the core went dark. The Nidal commander's roar of frustration was deafening, but the room was filled with a new sound, the hum of the ship's life support systems failing. The core had been disabled. The Vanguard had won its first battle. But the war had only just begun. The sudden silence that followed the shutdown of the Nidal core was deafening. The ship trembled beneath their feet, its once thrumming heartbeat now eerily quiet. Elias took a steadying breath, his pulse still racing from the chaos of the battle. The Nidal commander lay prone, struggling to rise, but its movements were sluggish, weakened by the loss of the core's power. Sia stood, her gravity manipulation still holding the commander down, though it was clear that she was exerting tremendous effort. Her breathing was shallow, sweat dripping down her face as she maintained the pressure. "It won't be down for long," she warned, her voice strained. "Then let's make this count," Elias said, gripping his rifle tighter. He shot a glance at Xander, who was already moving toward the fallen commander, his weapon drawn and ready. Xander, we take it down now. No mercy. Xander nodded without a word, his eyes narrowed with cold resolve. He closed in on the commander, his every step measured. The Nigel creature, weakened but still alive, let out a low, guttural growl, its glowing eyes locked on them with purer malice. It was down but far from out. Elias didn't hesitate. He sprinted toward the commander, weaving through the debris that lit at the room from the earlier battle. As he neared the beast, he saw its sword, still lying on the ground next to it. His fingers itched for the weapon, but he knew that wasn't the solution. The Nihil was a force of nature, and brute strength alone wouldn't be enough to bring it down. He needed strategy. Xander, cover me. Elias shouted as he dove for the commander's exposed side. He aimed his rifle at the creature's joints, firing with precision, targeting the weak points in its armor. Each shot rang out with a sharp crack, the plasma bolts sizzling against the dark metal. The commander howled in pain, thrashing beneath Sia's gravity hold. But it was still moving, still pushing back with all its might. Xander fired at its torso, hitting it in the chest, but the energy blasts seemed to do little more than scorch the surface. "This thing is a damn tank," he yelled. Sia clenched her fists, a pulse of energy pushing the gravity fields further. The floor cracked beneath her, and the pressure built as the commander was forced further into the ground. "It's not going to get up, not unless we break its armor completely." Lyra stepped forward, her eyes wide as she stared at the central control panel. Her fingers moved rapidly across her wrist console, her brow furrowed in concentration. "I've got an idea," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "If I can access the ship's remaining systems, I can trigger a chain reaction that will destabilize the remaining power sources. It's a risk, but it might just give us the edge we need." Elias exchanged a glance with the others. It was a desperate move, but with the ship crumbling and the Nidal still standing, they didn't have many choices left. "Do it," he said. "We've got to end this now." Lyra nodded, fingers flying across her console as she connected to the remaining systems. The room seemed to pulse around them, the ship itself groaning as it strained against the energy siphon. It wasn't just the Nihil that was dying. It was the ship as well. A cataclysmic chain reaction was building, and with it, a chance for the Vanguard to escape. Elias took a deep breath and turned his attention back to the commander. The creature had managed to lift its head, its eyes glowing with a cruel, malevolent light. It was no longer just a soldier. It had become the embodiment of the Nihil's relentless nature. Elias could see the creature's breath, shallow and labored, but it wasn't done fighting. He took a step forward, determination in his eyes. "This is it, you bastard," he muttered. With a sudden burst of strength, the Nihil commander launched itself upward, tearing through Sia's gravity field with a shocking force. The shockwave threw everyone off balance, and the commander's sword, now pulsing with dark energy, swung toward Elias in a blinding arc. Without thinking, Elias dove sideways, narrowly avoiding the blade that cleaved through the air where he had been standing just a moment ago. His heart raced as he scrambled to his feet, but the creature was already moving, faster than he anticipated. "Watch out!" Xander shouted as he fired again, but the commander deflected the shots with a swift swipe of its massive weapon. Sia, exhausted but resolute, focused again, pushing her energy into one final devastating gravity push. The commander's momentum faltered for a split second, and that was all Elias needed. He dove forward, using his momentum to grab the sword from the ground. With a roar of defiance, he swung the Nidal weapon with all his strength, aiming for the weak spot in the creature's armor. The blade cut through the air with a deafening sound, and with a final, heart-stopping strike, it connected. The commander let out an ear-splitting scream, its body jerking violently as the blade sank deep into its chest. For a long moment, the room was still. Then, with a slow, shuddering collapse, the commander fell to the ground, its massive form crumpling like a broken puppet. Its eyes dimmed, and the once immense threat was no more. Elias stood over the fallen giant, chest heaving, the Nigel sword still clutched in his hands. His body screamed in exhaustion, but there was no time to rest. The ship was dying, and the fight was far from over. "We need to move now," Elias shouted, turning back to the team. The chain reaction had begun. They had won this battle, but the war was just beginning. The air was thick with the acrid scent of burning circuits, and the heavy hum of a ship that was unraveling at its core. Elias's heart thundered in his chest as the realization hit him. They had taken down the Nihil commander, but they were still trapped in the crumbling remains of the enemy warship. The chain reaction Lyra had initiated was only a temporary solution. It wouldn't be long before the ship completely broke apart. "Everyone, move!" Elias shouted, his voice strained but urgent. He tossed the Nigel sword aside, his hands now firmly gripping his rifle. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the best route to escape. The ship groaned around them, as if echoing their desperation. Sparks flew from the walls, and the overhead lights flickered erratically. Shaya was already moving, her feet light as she used her gravity manipulation to propel herself across the room. "We've got less than 5 minutes before this thing disintegrates," she called over her shoulder, her tone sharp and commanding. Xander, his face bruised but determined, pushed himself to his feet and joined her. "We need to find the escape pods. Now." Lyra was still working, her fingers flying across her wrist console as she monitored the ship's systems. Her face was pale, but there was no sign of hesitation in her eyes. "I've overridden the pod lockouts. They're online, but the closest exit is on the far side of the ship. We'll have to go through the maintenance tunnels to get there." Elias nodded. "Lead the way." The team moved in unison, each of them carrying the weight of the battle they had just fought, but pushing forward nonetheless. The corridors they passed through were dark, lit only by the occasional flicker of emergency lights. The walls were torn and dented, the ship's once pristine interior now a battlefield, reflecting the damage they'd inflicted on the Nihil. As they sprinted through the winding hallways, the sound of the ship's groaning hull grew louder. The floor beneath their feet buckled at intervals, making every step a risk. Elias kept his eyes forward, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps as the adrenaline kept him moving. "We can't stop," he muttered under his breath. "We're too close." The others, equally focused, didn't need any more encouragement. They kept running, Xander and Sia leading the way, with Lyra and Elias bringing up the rear. Every corner they turned seemed to present more obstacles. Blown-out doors, collapsed debris, and erratic energy surges that forced them to leap or duck to avoid deadly electrical arcs. It was a race against time, but Elias could feel the pressure mounting. Every second they wasted, the ship drew closer to its final moments. It wasn't just the Nihil they had to worry about now. It was the collapsing warship itself. As they reached the entrance to the maintenance tunnels, a loud explosion rang out behind them. The ship's structure groaned, and the floor jolted violently. For a split second, Elias thought they might have been too late. But then Lyra's voice cut through the chaos. "Down here," she shouted, pointing to the narrow hatch that led into the tunnels. Without hesitation, The team dove into the passageway, sliding into the dimly lit, cramped space. The hatch slammed shut behind them, cutting off the noise from the rest of the ship. For a moment, there was only the sound of their labored breathing, echoing in the tunnel's narrow confines. "Go," Elias barked. "We don't have much time." They moved quickly, following Lyra's directions as she navigated them through the winding tunnels. The walls of the maintenance passages were even more damaged than the rest of the ship, and Elias had to duck low several times to avoid beams or twisted pipes that hung precariously overhead. "Just a little farther," Lyra said, her voice a strained whisper. She glanced over her shoulder at Elias, her expression grim. "The escape pods are just ahead, but we're not out yet." Suddenly, a loud crash rang through the tunnel, and the entire structure seemed to shake. Elias gritted his teeth and kept moving. What was that? "A breach in the hull," Lyra explained, her voice tight with worry. "We're losing atmosphere in certain sections. We have to make it to the pods before we get sealed off." The sense of urgency doubled. Every footstep felt heavier now, and the walls seemed to close in around them, the suffocating weight of the situation pressing on their shoulders. The ship was coming apart piece by piece, and they were at the mercy of its collapsing structure. Finally, they reached a large reinforced door at the end of the tunnel. The glow of emergency lights illuminated the escape pod bay. Lyra immediately moved to the control panel, her fingers flying over the keys as she bypassed the pod's lock systems. "We're almost there," Lyra said, her voice filled with relief as the door slid open, revealing the sleek, metallic pods lined up in neat rows. The hum of their emergency systems sounded like a promise of salvation. But just as Elias began to step forward, a sudden sharp cry rang out from behind them. It was Sia. She turned to face the group, her face pale but determined. "Something's wrong," Sia said, her voice steady but tense. "I felt it. Something's following us." Before anyone could respond, the ground beneath them trembled again, this time far stronger than before. The lights above flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. And then, from the shadows ahead, came the unmistakable sound of heavy mechanical footsteps. The Nigel weren't finished yet. The Vanguard had fought through the impossible. Now they had to escape it. The moment the tremor shook the corridor, the sense of doom became palpable. Elias felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up as the deep, mechanical footsteps grew louder. He spun around, rifle raised, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Keep moving," Elias barked, as his eyes scanned the darkness. He had no idea what was coming, but it didn't matter. The ship was falling apart, and their escape was their only priority. He glanced toward Lyra, who was already pulling open the nearest escape pod door. "Get in, now," Lyra shouted, her hands shaking as she gestured to the pod. The panels on the walls flashed red, signaling that the ship's systems were failing faster than they had anticipated. But the sound of those footsteps, dreadfully close, spurred him into action. They had no time for hesitation. Sia, ever the strategist, was already moving towards the pod as well, her eyes narrowing. "We're not alone," she whispered, her power pulsing faintly in the air as she set the gravity around her. "That's not just the ship collapsing. Something's hunting us." The footsteps grew louder, shaking the ground with their weight. Elias's instincts screamed for them to hurry, but the tension in the air was suffocating. What had they left behind? Was it just one of the Nihil's dreadnoughts, or something worse? "Alexander, check the rear," Elias ordered. He glanced to his left, then to his right, watching as his comrades scrambled for the pods. Xander crouched low, his eyes scanning the dark, his every muscle coiled. "Whatever it is, "It's not letting us leave without a fight," he muttered, his voice grim. "Stay ready." The distant sound of clanking grew deafening, reverberating in their bones. It wasn't just a single creature. It sounded like an entire army moving in sync, dragging the weight of their endless pursuit with every step. It felt as if the Nihil were closing in from every direction. The Vanguard was surrounded. The pod doors slid shut behind Lyra and Xander, but Elias and Sia weren't far behind. Elias barely had time to glance back before another shockwave rocked the tunnel, causing a series of sparks to fly from the broken systems above. The ship's fragile frame groaned in protest. "Get in the pod." Elias snapped again, grabbing Sia's arm. Her usually calm demeanor was now a mirror of the urgency flooding their minds. They couldn't waste any more time. But then, as if the darkness had a mind of its own, something moved. Out of the shadows and wreckage ahead, a figure emerged, a giant shadow, outlined by flickers of malfunctioning lights. The silhouette was humanoid in shape, but its eyes, glowing with an unnatural malevolent energy, pierced the blackness like twin suns. It was the Nihil commander, or what remained of it. The blast Elias had delivered to the beast's chest was far from enough to kill it. Somehow, impossibly, the commander had survived. Its once pristine armor was now a twisted, jagged shell, parts of it held together by tendrils of black, liquid energy that writhed like living vines. Elias's breath hitched. The commander was no longer just a weapon. It had become something more, a deadly amalgamation of the Nihil's dark technology and raw destructive force. The creature's eyes locked on them with intense fury, and the metallic roar of its voice rumbled through the air, unnatural and guttural. "UKN and OT-ST ape." The commander bellowed, its voice carrying through the collapsing ship like an omen of death. Saya wasted no time. With a violent thrust of her gravity manipulation, she created an invisible barrier in front of the commander, a powerful force that slammed against its advancing form. The commander recoiled for a moment, but it wasn't enough. It had learned to resist her powers, just as the Vanguard had learned to adapt. "Get to the pods now," Elias ordered, his voice commanding but strained. He turned to Xander, who was already in motion, fingers gripping his weapons as he took aim at the advancing nightmare. The commander's glowing eyes narrowed, and it leaped forward with inhuman speed, its massive sword trailing behind it like a death sentence. Sia gasped, pushing harder with her gravity field, but the beast was relentless. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed as the commander cleaved through the air. Elias sprinted toward the nearest pod, his heart pounding in his chest. He reached the open hatch, but a violent force slammed into his side, knocking him off his feet and sending him sprawling across the floor. "Sia!" Elias yelled as he tried to rise, but the ship was collapsing beneath them, the walls shaking with the force of the Nihil's assault. He looked up to see the commander towering over him, sword raised high. Xander, now on his feet, opened fire, but the energy blasts seemed to bounce harmlessly off the commander's reinforced armor. The creature growled in response, turning its attention back to Elias, and just as it was about to bring down the killing blow, a bright flash of light erupted in the tunnel. It was Lyra. She had activated a nearby emergency flare, blinding the creature for just an instant. The distraction was enough for Elias to dive into the pod, narrowly avoiding the commander's lethal strike. "Go!" Elias shouted, his voice hoarse, as he crawled into the pod, his hands shaking from the effort. He slammed the pod door shut just as the commander's sword struck the metal with a deafening crash. The pod began to rumble, and the last of the ship's power systems kicked in, thrusting them into the air with a jolt. But it was a fragile escape. The commander's roars echoed in the distance, and Elias knew their nightmare wasn't over. As the pod shot into the cold void of space, Elias allowed himself one brief moment of relief. They had escaped the immediate danger, but their enemies were still out there waiting. The fight wasn't finished yet, not by a long shot. The final battle for Earth's survival was just beginning. The cold void of space stretched out before them as the escape pod hurtled through the galaxy. Inside, the Vanguard was silent, each member lost in their thoughts, the weight of their near-death experience settling like a stone in their chests. Elias glanced around the small interior of the pod. Lyra was strapped in beside him, her expression distant, her fingers twitching over her wrist console as she monitored their flight path. Xander sat with his arms crossed, his eyes narrowed, as though searching for answers in the darkness outside. Sia, usually calm under pressure, seemed distant, her gaze unfocused as she stared at nothing in particular. Elias wanted to say something, to offer words of comfort, but there was nothing to say. Their escape had been a miracle, nothing short of it. They had fought against impossible odds, faced down a force that should have destroyed them all. Yet here they were, alive, but not unscathed. "Lyra," he finally spoke, his voice hoarse. "Where are we headed?" She glanced up at him, her face a mask of determination and exhaustion. "We're heading to the nearest relay station. From there, we can send a distress signal to the fleet. They'll know what happened, and we'll have a chance to regroup, but it's going to take time." Time. It was a luxury they didn't have. Elias knew the Nihil weren't the only threat they faced. The galaxy was teetering on the edge of something much worse, and the Vanguard was the last line of defense. Time. Xander muttered, his voice laced with bitterness. "We don't have time. The Nihil will be sending reinforcements. We're already too far behind." Elias's gaze hardened. "We've bought some time. That's all we can do. We make it count." Sia finally spoke, her voice breaking the silence. "What happens when they find us?" The question hung in the air, and Elias met her eyes. "We fight. We make sure they never find Earth." The pod's engines hummed as they entered a nearby asteroid belt, the sudden turbulence shaking the vessel. Lyra adjusted the controls, her eyes scanning the navigational map. "We'll be in the relay station's range in 2 hours. But if we're detected before then, we'll have a serious problem." Elias leaned back in his seat, thinking. They couldn't outrun the Nile. They knew too much about them. But the relay station was their best chance. They could signal the fleet, rally the remaining resistance. The Vanguard was a symbol of hope, but they needed more than just hope. They needed an army. "We'll need to fortify the station," Elias said, his mind already working through the logistics. "We can't let it fall into enemy hands. If the Nihil take it, they'll know we're here." Xander nodded grimly. "Agreed. But we need weapons, supplies. The station might be a dead zone by the time we get there." "Then we find a way to make it operational," Lyra said, her voice steady with resolve. "We can't afford to wait. We'll fix it, or we'll die trying." There was a silence in the pod, but it wasn't the same kind of heavy silence they'd felt on the ship. This was different, filled with purpose. Suddenly, a sharp alarm rang out. Elias's heart skipped a beat as the lights in the pod flickered. His eyes snapped to Lyra, who was already typing furiously on her console. "We've been detected," she said, her voice sharp with urgency. "A Nihil fleet has just entered the system. They're searching for us." A chill ran down Elias's spine. They hadn't made it far enough. The Nihil were already here, and their escape was just the beginning of another fight. But this time, it would be different. "They won't find us alive," Elias muttered, his hands clenched into fists. Sea's voice was a low whisper, yet there was strength behind it. "This ends today." Elias met her gaze. He could see it in their eyes, the same fire that had driven them to survive, the same fire that had propelled them forward through the impossible. This wasn't just a fight for survival anymore. It was a fight for everything they believed in, for Earth, for humanity, for the future. They had been the last line of defense, the Vanguard standing against the darkness. And now they were about to become something more, a symbol of resistance that the Nihil could never erase. "I'm with you," Xander said, his voice steady. "Let's finish this." Lyra smiled grimly. "We'll give them hell." Elias's heart was filled with determination. They wouldn't be the last defenders of Earth. They would be the first to strike back. The Nihil had made a grave mistake, and they were about to learn that underestimating humanity was the last thing they should have done. As the pod shot toward the relay station, a final roar echoed in the distance. The Nihil were coming. But the Vanguard was ready, and they would never stop fighting. Humanity's last hope had not fallen. It had risen.